Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here are a couple European nightcrawler worm bins. Well, to be more precise, this bin here is actually a European nightcrawler bin. This one here is actually the material that the European nightcrawlers used to reside in. It's their castings. And I labeled it as European nightcrawler cocoons, with the assumption that there's a whole bunch of cocoons in that material that are probably on the verge of probably hatching at this point. I started this bin trying to move the worms out of a bin that I've long since finished. That bin ended. It was at that point the last of the worms got moved out, and then I just set these castings aside. So maybe, by this time we've got some worms in here already. And we've even gone so far as to start setting up one edge of the bin, which you could see covered in plastic down here, this orange piece of plastic. One edge of the bin has already been set up to try luring the worms out of the material. Little baby worms, and I believe last time we were in here we already started observing some little baby worms. So I'm going to go into this bin first, and we're going to check in on how things are going. And last time we did observe some worms, so this time if we spot any, we're going to actually remove them and move them over. And if, everything else looks good otherwise, maybe the only other thing we'll do is kind of till up the castings material, help it dry, maybe bring some of the more dry stuff that's out on the surface and sink it down low, and bring some of the more damp stuff that's down low and bring it up high. By that material being a little bit dry, it might motivate the baby worms to go look for a more hospitable spot. Over here under the plastic is where they're going to find the nice damp spot where there's also food. So once we're done doing that, we'll release whatever worms we've collected into here. We're also going to apply a feeding, because it's been a week since we checked in on these, and we fed, but after a week I would assume that we could probably maybe add a little bit more too. And there was a lot of mites going on in here too, so I'm curious to see how the neem cake that I've been using to treat that situation is coming along. Hopefully we're reducing the number of mites, but I really don't know how long that's going to take. But since we did see quite a number of mites in here, I'm expecting we'll still probably see some, but it would be really nice if we saw a reduction in their numbers. So let's get to work. We'll start with this one. Let's head over to the bench. Yeah, it's always hindsight is 20/20 sort of a situation. Last week people made comments when I was kind of picking worms one at a time out of the finished compost as I encountered them. Not the baby worms that were hatched here, ones that just sort of slipped through the screening process. And people were questioning, why didn't I just remove them while I had them in my hand rather than leaving them in the system? Granted, I did move them over to this edge where I would like for the worms to eventually congregate, where there's, fresh bedding, moisture, even some food added. So I've, at least positioned them closer to where I'd like them to be. But it is true that I definitely could have removed them while I already had direct contact with them. So this time I believe we will do just that. We'll figure out some way to move them over, keep them cozy until we can release them into their new home. So let me just grab something I could place them into temporarily. Oh, this little guy really doesn't like the idea of being out here in this bright light, and I don't blame him. I got this little plastic cup that we could position the worms in, whatever ones we bump into along the way. So yeah, like I said, the material in here, if I remember correctly, was screened. Is that right? Was it screened? I'm trying to remember now. Let me think. How did I separate the worms? It might not have been screened, because if you look at this stuff, it would not pass through a screen. Might have been a little bit too damp for it to be handled that way. So maybe I lured the worms out of the material using a method similar to what you see here, kind of a migration approach. And then I just took the remaining casting material and placed it in here to give the cocoons that I assumed were in it time to hatch. Because from what I remember, I would just look through this material and I would see cocoons all over the place. So it seemed It seemed like a shame to just allow the cocoons to be part of a batch of finished castings that would probably just get used out in the garden, releasing all those worms that could, you know, just as easily be collected after the fact. And like, you know, over here we're seeing a little tiny worm on my ring finger here. It is realistic to think that that baby worm may have been actually hatched here. And here's another fairly small baby worm, as well as another one I'm seeing right down here. This one's really quite tiny. And another one. So yeah, there's definitely baby worms in here, and based on their size, it is probably realistic to think that, you know, they may have been hatched here within this container, or shortly before the container was set up as a cocoon nursery. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been expecting to see here, and I think we already saw a little hint of it happening last time we were in here a week ago. It was a pretty good number of little baby worms cruising around in this material. Some of them really are super tiny. I'm surprised I saw that one. He's so small. Another tiny one right there next to it. So, you know, for me to pick through this like, you know, like I've been doing here as a demonstration is a bit time consuming, so I'm certainly not going to make an entire video out of me picking worms out. I just figured if a couple are really obvious and right there, easy to fetch out of the material, then we'll do so. But, you know, the purpose of this material over here on the edge is to do just that, is to collect them in such a way that I don't have to do it, you know. It's in a way that the worms themselves congregate over there on their own, based on the fact that there's moisture there because of the plastic covering that I removed in the beginning, as well as some food that was placed in there. I'm trying to remember now, I believe there's already been a couple applications of food put in there. I don't even know why I would have supplemented it. It's very likely that the food that was placed in there originally probably didn't run out, but I believe my tracking spreadsheet did indicate that there have been a couple applications of food in here. So, you know, I mean, I'm definitely seeing cocoons here and there, and I generally don't spend a lot of time on them in my videos because, you know, I could hold this tiny little thing the size of a peppercorn here for you to see, and you may or may not even be able to see it. But you should be able to, you know, at least trust that I'm not trying to deceive you when I tell you that there are, you know, a good number of cocoons in here that I pretty much see in every handful as I move the material around. So the material is luckily getting a little bit more manageable. It's not very manageable when it's big clumps like this. You want the stuff to kind of flow pretty readily, as you see a lot of it doing already. But it would be nice if the entire batch of finished castings all behaved in that fashion. So now I'm trying to think if we really want to do an extraction of the feeding area. It wasn't really my intention. My intention was just to examine the material, and at the same time, if I do bump into worms, then grab them since they're right there. So we'll do just that. We'll grab any ones we still bump into and we can easily retrieve as we're stirring up the material and inspecting to see how the progress of this bin is coming along. But we're not going to mess with the feeding area. We're just going to allow the migration of the worms to occur on its own in there, and at some point later we'll actually do an extraction of all that material to get the worms out. So I'm not really in any sort of a particular rush. So I really don't know exactly how much more time to give this. But I'm assuming at least a couple more weeks. And during that time, we'll continue checking in and tilling the material around like this to help it dry, to break it up, get it a little bit more loose. And then at some point, we'll just call it as a done deal, and then we'll bless this material as a batch of truly finished vermicompost. You know, some of these cocoons definitely have a more vivid, kind of bright orangish color. As they get older, they take on a much darker color. We probably don't have too many cocoons that were recently deposited in here by maybe 2 of the adult worms that snuck through or that remained in the material at the end and mated. Because if they did, then maybe there are just a few freshly deposited cocoons for which we're not going to provide enough time for those to hatch and baby worms to emerge and make their way over into the feeding area. But by removing the adult worms here, it does, limit the likelihood of that happening, so that we don't end up with a whole bunch of just ongoing creation of fresh cocoons in here. We are dealing with cocoons that, can be almost certainly assumed to be at least a certain age, meaning that there's only so much time remaining that you would need to give them before they can be all considered as hatched. So let's leave it at that. It's certainly not a lot of worms, but we'll chuck them into the new bin, where all of the worms that have made their way over here already are also going to be positioned. And I'm just curious, like I said, I'm not going to extract worms out of here, but I would like to see, or at least get some sort of affirmation in my own mind that what I've got going on here is performing the function that it's here for, which is rounding up whatever worms might have still remained in the system, these slightly larger adult worms, which at this point I'm not going to keep picking out, as well as baby worms that were hatched in here, which we may or may not observe. Little babies might be tucked inside of the crevices of the cardboard corrugation, or who knows where. They're still probably pretty small in size if they have made their way over here, if they were just hatched in the past few weeks. So yeah, I definitely saw a couple more mature worms that have made their way in here, but not many, and I can't say that I really observed many, if any, baby worms. And there does seem to be kind of a hot spot over in this corner where some of the more mature worms that are in the system have made their way over, and what the heck, as long as I've got them in my hand, it would be foolish to put them back in the bin. So let's just consider them as being part of this move over into the new space, especially since I could just look down and see a whole bunch of them here in a little pile. I might as well just fetch them too while we're here. But like I said, this feeding zone is here for that purpose of collecting worms, and at some point we'll just move it over lock, stock, and barrel with the bedding that they're inhabiting and whatever food scraps might still be in here. And I would have to assume that whatever food has been placed in here over time is probably still sufficient. And even if it isn't, I would assume that the juices that have flowed out of those bits of veggies and fruits that were placed in here have soaked into the paper, into the cardboard, also making the cardboard a realistic kind of food source that the worms can take advantage of. I'm just gonna, what I'm gonna do? Not necessarily as a feeding per se, but just in case there's any mites that might want to come along for the ride too, the neem cake is there to try to reduce mite numbers. And since moisture, I think, is also a key factor in making this this feeding area attractive to the worms, I also see no harm in maybe applying just a little bit of moisture into here too, in contrast to the material that's over on this edge, which is just continuing to dry and dry, to maybe, maybe make that another reason why the worms will want to come over, or if they just happen upon the space over here, then give them a reason to stay. All right, that's cool. Let's get this thing covered back up and let it continue. So I don't know how much longer, like I said before, maybe a couple more weeks of this. We'll let it continue, and then we'll have another batch of castings and one fewer bin that needs tending to. All right, let's go get the regular bin that the worms are in now. So this is the container that the worms reside in, and like I mentioned earlier, I was definitely seeing some mite activity in here. And I think we'll begin by trying to see if we can expose the area where we had observed the mites, which was pretty much right down the middle, which is where the feeding occurred. And this way I might be able to compare a little bit more easily how the mite population is looking relative to how it looked a week ago. Because this NEEM, this NEEM cake or NEEM seed meal, it's really got sort of a delay to its effectiveness in terms of being able to observe its effects on mite populations. Because the way I understand the stuff to work is that it's not going to kill any mites outright. It's going to inhibit their ability to reproduce and spawn off that next generation of baby mites. And maybe some of these little white specks that we're observing in here, maybe some of them are the grit that I normally administer with the feedings in my bins, because I use crushed eggshell as grit, but I would assume that the majority of these white specks that we're observing down here are actually mites and not crushed eggshell. And there is pretty much mites everywhere. So I'm just going to try to expose the majority of this material down in here, and then we'll shoot a little bit of time lapse just so we can get a better handle on what it is that we're dealing with here. But I don't think there's been any improvement since last week, because last week this whole surface was pretty much moving with mite activity. And I mean, once in a while you find a piece of fruit or some sort of material that there's a greater number of mites hanging out on. I'm not seeing that here. I don't see anything with any particular concentration. It seems like almost everything has just an abundant number of mites all over it. So let's shoot a little time lapse of this just so we can get a better handle on what kind of mite population we've still got going on in here. Well, I believe it's clear to see that there's definitely a good amount of mite activity in here. And since the NEEM cake is what's supposedly going to help control their numbers, why don't we start by putting a little bit of it right onto them. I guess you do need them to consume the stuff, presumably, for it to have an effect. So hopefully they're not distracted by some of the other food items that they're going to be getting. So now I've got some coffee filters here. A lot of times I just chuck them into the bins dry, but this time I figured I would dump them into this little container where I've got some water sitting. So I've got some bits of cardboard here too that I wanted to throw in as additional bedding. So this is like a sort of cardboard that's similar to egg carton, and down here you've just got some paper towel or toilet paper type tube cardboard that I chunked up into little pieces. So let's add that next after we put a little bit of the food in that I bought down here. One thing I normally don't feed a lot of is citrus, but on this go around we're going to go ahead and put half of an orange in here. We'll see how that does. And then I've got some other pretty easily recognizable items here. It's a piece of banana peel, it's the butt end of a head of lettuce, and a lot of this green stuff over here is, I believe, the peels off of cucumbers, and what it's stuck to is a pear that went really bad. Doesn't even really take on or hold on to its pear shape anymore because it's already so far gone. So even though it's frozen, it just falls apart because it was put into the freezer at a pretty advanced state of decomposition and spoiling. And I'm assuming that it's stuff like the pear, the banana peel. It's those things that I'm assuming that the mites are really going to get jazzed about. So let's make sure we go ahead and put a good amount of neem cake or neem seed meal onto those particular bits. But who knows, maybe they're going to really enjoy the citrus, so let's throw some on there too. And the stuff I'm sprinkling in here is something I made mention of earlier. It's the pulverized eggshell, and you could see how it's very similar in size to the mites. But when you put it in fresh, it's still got a really kind of a bright appearance to it, a nice bright color. So I've got some coffee here, but before we drop the coffee in, why don't we get rid of the remainder of this bedding type stuff, this cardboard that I bought along for the ride here. This is a relatively new bin, you know, maybe a month and a half old, not even yet. 42 days, I believe, is the age, so there's certainly going to be plenty of time for this bin to work down all these materials. So it's a pretty generous feeding. Now we can get a closer look at some of the leftovers. So here you can see some other coffee filters that were placed in here as part of the previous feeding as bedding supplement. More of the same, I believe, here. I'm trying to see if I can catch a glimpse of any of the previous feeding. This right here would be a banana peel showing about a week's worth of progress, with mites obviously here to help out a lot too. A lot of times you'll see worms crawling all over a banana peel, and it makes me wonder if the mites being all over it is kind of turning the worms off or something. I would hate to think that. But hopefully at some point soon we're going to begin seeing the effects of this neem cake, if it even works. I'm very skeptical because it's been quite some time now since I've been attempting to reduce the number of mites in my systems using a whole slew of different approaches, this being the most recent approach. And I always try to go at it with a certain degree of faith that, yeah, this is going to be the silver bullet. This is going to knock them out once and for all, but I've so far, not yet at least, stumbled on the solution. I mean, we might be in the thick of the solution, kind of working its magic slowly with minimal visible effects so far. So I think we've got a little transplant of worms to take care of here too, right? So let's not forget these little guys out on my table. So it was a little jumble of collected adult worms that we pulled out of the feeding area and just out of the system in general, combined with a couple little baby worms as well that we snatched out of the castings. So we'll reunite them with their friends and neighbors who got relocated into the system once upon a time in the past. Before we cover up though, I'd like to just see how things look out on the edge, because I was getting this kind of feeling during the filming of last week's video when we checked in on this bin last that the worm population almost seemed like it was hanging out on the outskirts of the bin, almost as if to avoid where all the mites were hanging out, which was down in the middle where the feedings had been getting placed. So we're seeing some worms hanging out here on the outskirts. I guess the other benefit to what we're doing here is that we're kind of tilling up the material and aerating it a little bit. But with all this bedding and everything in here, I'm not even sure it's so important, but I'm kind of an advocate of aeration of the material in my bins. The bubble wrap that was covering things does seem to be holding on to the moisture in the system pretty nicely. I kind of flip-flopped on the plastic coverings. A couple weeks ago this was covered with a sheet of plastic going edge to edge all across the top. But I've been suspicious of that practice as potentially being the cause of excess moisture in my systems. So I throttled that back and left the system covered with only paper for about a week. And then last week we came back with the bubble wrap as the substitute plastic covering. I guess a little bit of an enhancement over just covering with paper, because paper doesn't really hold moisture in very much. When you got a bin that's full of almost all finished castings, the finished castings themselves do a wonderful job holding on to moisture, but as you look through this system, you can see that the majority of the material in here is just bedding type stuff. It's leaves, it's cardboard, it's paper. And that sort of stuff I don't think has quite the ability to hang on to moisture the way finished castings do. So when a bin is still relatively young, like this system is, it does sort of make sense to try to protect the moisture content a little bit from evaporation. And then maybe later on, start to put a little bit more faith into the material within the bin as having its own ability to hang on to its own moisture once it's predominantly castings. So that's where we stand now. I've got this leftover neem cake. I didn't even notice. So maybe before we put this thing aside, back up onto the shelf, maybe we've still got a little last ditch effort to apply a little bit more of this neem seed meal or neem cake, whatever you want to call it. And just give the whole top surface a little bit of a treatment. Although I do get this sense that the majority of the mites in the bin are probably down where the food is. But it does seem like some of them hang out on the surface too, so let's give them some of the neem meal too, the ones that hang out on the surface. I think somehow some of them are drawn to the food down below and some of them are drawn to the moisture that's recirculating up here on the top. So let's make sure we give each one its own fair share of neem seed meal or neem cake. Because I'd love to see all of them gone, not just some of them. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Oh, and guess what? I'm not going to add it now. It's just going back in the kitchen. I forgot to add the coffee. What a dope. It's one of my signature gaffes. And there I go, doing it again. It's been a while. So I got to give myself a little bit of credit for not making that mistake for quite some time now. But whatever. I guess it was only a matter of time. Alright everyone, see you next time. Bye now.